Thank you very much, John, for the kind introduction. Thank you to Jonathan and the rest of Pusey House for the invitation to be here. I was told right at the start to make sure that my electrical rigging is functioning. Got the thumbs up. Okay, great. Yes, thanks again to Pusey House. It's a place for which I've had occasion to be grateful over the years. Very happy to increase my debt today. Talking to you about Paideia practice, exemplarist ethics in the 4th century culture wars. There's quite a lot in that title. Some of it's very loaded, so I'll flag bits and pieces of it as they come up in the talk itself. And to start with, I want to say something about the exemplarist bit. And I think the best way to do that is to start actually not with the 4th century in the Greek-speaking world, which is what I'll largely be talking about and what we've heard a little bit about so far, but to start with a couple of examples that go at once far prior to that and at once at the same time far beyond that. And I want to start by a famous exemplar drawn from Roman history. This is one that is commonly referred to a number of writers, and this is the story of Mucius, so-called Scaevola. So a quick recap for those of you for whom it's been a little while since encountering this particular character. Early in the days of the Roman Empire, when the republic was very fragile, threatened by a kind of counter-revolutionary Etruscan invasion, things are not looking good for Rome. And there's an Etruscan army encamped on the other side of the river, and the young Mucius volunteers to go over and assassinate Lars Porsena, the king of the opposing army. And he duly infiltrates the camp, sneaks out with his dagger, and stabs somebody who looks nice and regal. And unfortunately, it's not the king. So he's arrested, he's brought before the king, he's interrogated, and is threatened with torture, specifically by a fire. And looking at the king, he extends his right hand over the flame, into the flame, without flinching. Everyone watches as his hand is burnt to a crisp. And Mucius looks at the king and says, "There's hundreds more young Romans like me coming to kill you." And Lars Porsena says, "All right, that's very nice, thank you. I think I'll pack up and go back home." And in that way, he saved his city, won undying fame for himself and his descendants as Mucius Scaevola, a.k.a. Lefty. I want to read from now a modern novel from the middle of the 19th century, in which this episode is remembered obliquely. And to frame it, this is from War and Peace, from which number epilogue? First epilogue, chapter 16 of the first epilogue. Tolstoy had a hard time knowing when to finish. And the scene is a young man. He's an adolescent, and he's just had a kind of difficult session with his tutors, some of the elders in his family, and he's left alone with all his adolescent aspirations and dreams of grandeur. And he's frustrated because he can't quite exercise those or realize those yet. And so he says to himself, "Mucius Scaevola burnt his hand. Why shouldn't the same sort of thing happen to me? I know they, his family members, his tutors, want me to learn, and I will learn. But someday I shall have finished learning, and then I will do something. I only pray God that something may happen to me such as happened to Plutarch's men, and I will act as they did. Oh, I will do better. Everyone will know me, love me, and be delighted with me." And suddenly his bosom heaved with sobs, and he began to cry. I've taken this as a kind of starting point because I think it very vividly depicts precisely one of the most important ethical frameworks that we find in many of the sources from throughout ancient history, but in particular also from the window of late antiquity that we've been talking about today. I'll come back to exemplars and what exemplarism might mean, just to give you a sense of where I'd like to go with my remarks today. I want to step back a bit and, flagging the culture wars bit of the title, give you a sense of the broad arc of the 4th century. This has been nicely signposted by the previous speakers a bit, but I will just frame the arc in broad terms. Secondly, I'll try to just draw a few of the kind of key texts in indicating exemplarism as an ethos that was pervasive in antiquity, not just late antiquity, but actually in particular in this point of earlier antiquity in texts that were somehow canonical and still culture shaping in the 4th century. We'll see how the mature writings of some of the literary culture-making figures that we're looking at can be seen as putting Paideia into practice. So there's that bit of the title ticked. We'll then dive into some of the key figures in the story, so the Cappadocian fathers, and in particular Gregory of Nazianzen. Look at the ways they made what I call virtue exemplar or vice exemplar pairings. And we'll look at the ways some of the resistance that they faced in doing that. I then want to ask a couple of why should we care type questions, and I'll do that in 2 moves. One of those is going to be why should we care as people with some kind of historical interest, and then maybe why should we care from the perspective of audience members of the Cappadocians, audience members also of Julian to some extent. Okay, and then finally I'll try to imagine what Gregory Nazianzen may have wanted us to experience a bit of as we think about exemplars from antiquity. So first, setting the scene a little bit in terms of the cast of characters. There will be 4 authors more or less who crop up in my remarks. They're all born about the year 330, give or take a few years in either direction. 2 of them are brothers, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa. A third is a friend of theirs, Gregory of Nazianzen. And the 4th, although he was born elsewhere, he actually grew up very, very close to where they lived and were growing up, although they didn't know each other in boyhoods. And that 4th is Julian the Emperor, also known as Julian the Apostate. We'll say a little bit about him later. As a measure of the kinds of changes that the Roman Empire underwent in the 4th century, it's worth noting, I suppose, a bit of family history on the side of Basil of Caesarea and Gregory, eventually of Nyssa. Namely, their grandparents in particular experienced the Diocletianic persecutions, which in their area were sometimes severe. This was a family of means and had a lot to lose, of course, in terms of possibly their life, but also of their material goods. But as a function perhaps of the means that they had, they were able to escape into the wilderness. And when many, many years later, Gregory Nazianzen gives a funeral oration or a commemorative oration for his deceased friend Basil, he refers to some of the miraculous stories that apparently happened in the wilderness. And Gregory of Nyssa, Basil, and their other notable siblings would have been reared on these stories, and they would have, the family gathered around the fire some evening. They say, "Well, Grandpa, what happened then?" Or, "Dad, what happened to Grandma and Grandpa then?" And so, as children, this is very, very vivid to them. This fear of the Roman state and its coercive power being brought to bear on the Christian community. By the time the last of our cast of characters will die, things will look very, very different indeed. Basil will have had the opportunity to snub a Roman emperor who's trying to attend his church for a liturgy. Nazianzen will at least function as a kind of patriarch of Constantinople, the imperial city. Gregory of Nyssa will be the go-to preacher for deaths in the imperial family. Other things change. So you have a kind of mid-century moment where people like Athanasius make an early and eloquent Christian plea for religious liberty. And by the end of the 4th century, you have the coercive power of the state being applied on behalf of the Christian church against pagans to some extent and against dissenting or heretical Christians, including the first execution for heresy. It's worth noting that took place against the opposition of some notable bishops, such as Ambrose of Milan, Siricius of Rome. But it did happen. So there's a sea change that happens in the 4th century, and notwithstanding things like pagan orators such as Themisius, who will have a career for emperors regardless of of his paganism, their paganism, or various strains of Christianity, regardless of the fact that even somebody like Julian will have a Christian or two in his entourage. There is this sort of social commingling of pagans and Christians, but nonetheless, there is very, very significant change. But I don't want to frame culture wars as I'm using it in simply the pagan-Christian axis. That's one of them. And the flashpoint of Julian's teacher's law was certainly remembered in a very important way. There's the pagan-Christian dynamic, but there's a gentleman who may have slipped away who posed a question about tensions within the Christian camp. I don't know exactly about playing bishops against teachers per se, but certainly the case that somebody like Julian was adept at playing different theological factions in the Christian community against each other under the pretense of kind of religious liberty, restoring a bishop here, deposing a bishop there. This sort of thing was characteristic of the period in the wake of probably the greatest doctrinal controversy in the history of the church, which is Jesus God or some kind of superhuman, following around Nicaea and haunting the church certainly for the rest of the century. This sometimes spills over into street violence. You get riots in Rome over this, and there are persecutions from various emperors, Christians against each other, so that you even have pagan sources commenting on how scandalous it is to see the way Christians treat each other. So there's a pagan-Christian dynamic, there's an intra-Christian dynamic, and there's also the pagan camp is certainly not monolithic. Julian is something of an oddball. He's an apostate. He's raised Christian, Arian Christian, and he takes a kind of Christian zeal and to some extent a Christian ecclesiology to what he does with his attempt to organize the pagan priesthoods. And this is very far from being universally loved and approved by other pagans. And so with respect to the school's law, you have a pagan commentator who's later, in other respects, a great fan of Julian, but is scandalized a bit, or at least a bit embarrassed, and doesn't want to comment on it. He actually says it's best passed over in silence, that little episode. So we have a number of axes in this, what I've called somewhat provocatively, culture wars. Okay, a last word maybe on Julian. He found for some reason, or let's just say he found something very satisfying in a peculiar brand of Neoplatonism, which was heavily ritualized. Actually, you'll not take this wrong. If I suggest it's a kind of high church, maybe Anglo-Catholic Neoplatonism that Julian goes in for. Pusey Platonism, yeah. And this also affects the way he looks back on Christianity and looks forward to a certain sort of revived Christianity. All right. Let that be sufficient for our sense of 4th century as a whole. Number of intersecting axes there. The lens through which I want to look at that period, as I've mentioned, is what I'll call exemplarism or exemplarist ethics. And that's the sense, briefly, with reference to what you should have as text 1. Actually, do I have my own handout somewhere? I do. I have one in the end. So I take this definition from a contemporary analytic philosopher named Linda Zagzebski, who sees exemplars, or defines exemplars as being paradigmatically excellent persons, whom we see on close observation and with reflection to be admirable in all or most of their acquired traits. I'll more or less use something like that definition with 2 slight amendments. One, for some of the authors that we'll be looking at, it's not necessary to be admirable in all traits. One may well suffice. And for another, I take exemplars as being potentially also negative, so potentially also vicious. And she does as well. But the reason she's interested in this is that she's working on metaethics, which is something like a theory of how we come to have notions about what's right and wrong, how do we come to find our way through the ethical landscape. And there are different ways of doing this, by appealing to some kind of rich teaching on virtue, or by some sort of rules-based ethic, or by some kind of cost-benefit framework. And she says, well, regardless of whatever framework you adopt, whatever school of philosophy you adopt, probably you came to have it because you had some sort of a very profound experience in the presence of an admirable person, either a person whom you knew in flesh and blood, or some kind of character who lodged him or herself in your mind. So I've used this to, let's say, to understand the ubiquity of these exemplars in classical culture, and certainly not the only one to do this. There's a little bit of a cottage industry in exemplarist studies that's cropped up in the last 25 years or so. But I thought we'd just take a tour of some of the salient text that give us a little bit of window into what we saw with the young Russian prince in Tolstoy just at the start. Okay, so text 2 is from Xenophon, and this is his Symposium. One of the characters starts reminiscing about his education. He says, "My father was anxious to see me develop into a good man, and as a means to this, he compelled me to memorize all of Homer. So even now, I can repeat the whole Iliad and Odyssey by heart." It's very impressive. Why might he have done that? There's a clue that comes from Plato's Protagoras, also taking stock of the traditional education of the day, which says, "Teachers furnish their pupils with the works of good poets to read as they sit in class and are made to learn them off by heart. Here there are many admonitions, many descriptions and praises and eulogies of good men in times past, so that the young boy, by envying them, may imitate them and may yearn to become even as they were." So that's on the Greek side. Romans have basically the same approach. Livy, right at the outset of his great history, justifies the task of writing the project in part because, as in text 4, it's a treasure trove of exemplars. He says this is what is especially healthy and fruitful in studying history. You contemplate the lessons of all kinds of exemplars as they've been put down in clear records. From these sources, lay hold of what you may imitate for your own benefit and that of your country. Think Mucius, Lefty. Likewise, avoid what you find in them that is ignoble in its origins or ignoble in its ends. Seneca, somewhat tersely, says, "Passing through rules, the path is long, but through exempla, it is short and efficient." And the idea here that this is the path of philosophy, the path that leads us to the fullness of life, as a philosopher like Seneca would see it. This is mostly textual, what I've been looking at so far, but you have practices in, say, Roman Republican days of funeral processions, which would feature parades of basically icons that get trotted out of the family archive. And so you imagine yourself as a little Roman boy who maybe just lost grandpa, the paterfamilias, and then all of a sudden you've got portraits not just of grandpa, but also of great-grandpa and some uncle who fought with Scipio, or a hero of some of the wars against the Samnites, maybe even. You see all this filing past you on your way to the funeral pyre. That's quite impressive. And first of all, you're being told as a good Roman boy not to cry. So you're bottling up all this emotion, and then you see the greats of your family who've passed by, and you think, oh, I'm going to grow up someday. I'm going to have a chance to make my mark. And when I die, maybe I'll have lived the sort of life that somebody will think worth remembering in the funeral procession that's held hundreds of years from now. So it's an extremely rich and very potent and formative experience, I would say. So this sort of thing floating around in the culture. Equally, if not more important, for many of our authors will, of course, be the biblical tradition. Probably don't need to tell many of you in the room here how full the Old Testament is of enjoinders to remember. Often it's memory of the law, but it's sometimes also remembering the persons and events that happen, especially the Exodus and the travels of Abraham in Genesis, and then of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And a locus that gets picked up on by some of our authors is in Isaiah 51, when he says, "Look to Abraham, your father." But there's also parabiblical literature in the Jewish tradition, which is very interesting, such as the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, which takes some characters who are not really developed very much in terms of their personal profiles, but then are suddenly given rather rich interior lives in which, on their deathbeds, they're reflecting on their lives. Have they lived virtuous lives? Have they lived vicious lives? And they give themselves a kind of virtue-vice profile as their legacy to their sons. Finally, in the Christian period, imitation of exemplars is fairly ubiquitous, I would say. Direct lines from Christ are not many, but the ethos, I think, is pretty clear. I've just quoted the new commandment I give you. He says that you love one another as I have loved you. So you too love one another. It's everywhere in Paul. I've just given one line there, but there are probably at least a dozen places in which he encourages the recipients of his letters either to imitate himself or to imitate Christ. And so the question of how that hierarchy works out is an interesting one. But the imitative ethos is very, very clear. All right, just maybe a thought on exemplars as persons versus the kinds of texts in which they appear. I've already mentioned a smattering, a very, very diverse number of kinds of presentations of exemplars, everything from street processions through to dialogues and chronicles mostly. There's an interest in ancient rhetoricians in the form in which an exemplar, I'll say, is deployed, and then that the formal presentation of it is sometimes called an exemplum, or in the Greek paradigma or hypodeigma. I'm less interested in the form of the presentation, more interested in the content, so the kind of the concrete person who is presented in one of these texts. But I will mention just something of the spectrum that we have here. We have everything from long biographies, Plutarch, who goes in and out, some of the most interesting moments of the lives of great figures. And then we have an interesting handbook from a fellow named Valerius Maximus on the Latin side, with, let's say, chapters, subheadings on different kinds of virtues and tiny little snippets. So if you want to be inspired by justice, you flip through to where the justice chapter is, and you can read dozens of examples of Romans who showed great justice and the non-Romans who showed interesting sorts of acts of justice. So you have things like this. You also have just oblique remarks made in passing. Some of these sources, some of these genres in which exemplars would appear would have been, let's say, direct continuations of the kinds of education they're receiving in the grammatical schools, rhetorical schools, the progymnasmato referred to earlier. You have these preliminary rhetorical exercises whereby students are taught to adopt some sort of position or inhabit a character and speak as if being that particular person, but also sometimes to praise or to blame, and to analyze from the framework of a sort of virtue and vice-based moral vocabulary. All of these sorts of things continue in the mature writings of the authors that I'll be looking at. What I want to do now is to look at long last at some of these writings, and in particular I'm going to focus on the virtue exemplar pairings, or the vice exemplar pairings that I alluded to. In particular, there seems to be an assumption that we'll see in a moment in some of our texts, that there is some salient feature in a great person or character of history or of mythology or of scripture, and that this is what they're especially worth remembering for. we have any economists here? No?
Unfortunately not.
Has anyone heard of comparative advantage?
Yes.
Econ? Okay. Econ 101, the kind of idea that some countries are going to be, let's say you've got country A, country B. This is from American economics. So the example is given as guns and butter. So country A and country B both produce guns and butter, but country A is better at producing guns, and it's probably America, and country B is better at producing butter. So in time, country A is going to be an exporter of guns, and country B is going to be an exporter of butter, and in time even A is going to be buying B's butter, and B is going to be buying A's guns, even though they can both produce both products locally. Okay, so the kind of thought pairing here, I think, is very similar. You probably have better luck with philosophers than with economists. You have the function argument in the beginning of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, whereby an act reveals something about the essential nature of a thing. That's on the species level. But in both these cases, whether we're talking about gun production or the act which reveals the essential nature of a species, I think they're nice analogies for the kind of thought process that's happening here when our exemplarist authors turn to scripture, turn to mythology, turn to history, and look at great figures. They're looking for that one thing that they can, maybe two, sometimes three, that they can associate with the great figure. The result is that in a lot of the writings that we have these passages which I've called catalog texts. And I think even the term catalogos is used in very close context in one of Basil's writings. The kind of catalog texts where you have a list of these noteworthy figures paired directly either 1-to-1 or 1-to-2, 3, something like that, with virtues that are worth remembering in association. Okay, so this brings us to text 8. This is a eulogy that Gregory Nazianzen pronounces for his father, bishop before him. He says, but what was most excellent and most characteristic, though least generally recognized, was his simplicity and his freedom from guile and resentment. For among men of ancient and modern days, each is supposed to have had some special success, as each chanced to have received from God some particular virtue. Job unconquered patience in misfortune, Moses and David meekness, Samuel prophecy, seeing into the future, Phineas zeal, for which he has a name, Peter and Paul eagerness in preaching, sons of Zebedee magniloquence, once also they were called sons of thunder. Then he says, but why should I enumerate them all, speaking as I do among those who know this? And this is far from the only text that we have suggesting as much. The next one is text 9, a remark just made in passing in a very dense theological polemical treatise, Contra Eunomium of Gregory of Nyssa. And in the context, the argument he's making has to do with the reliability of names and their ability to connote reality. But the example he uses is something like this pairing. And he says, Noah was just, says Scripture, Abraham faithful, Moses gentle, Daniel wise, Joseph temperate, Job blameless, David proficient in endurance. And the same Gregory of Nyssa uses wording which is similar to Nazianzen's in a eulogy he gives for a deceased bishop. And he says, when the prudent church of Antioch first saw the man, Bishop Meletius, she saw a face truly formed in the image of God. She saw love springing forth. She saw grace falling from his lips. She saw the highest bounds of humility, beyond which no more may be conceived. She saw David's gentleness, Solomon's understanding, Moses' goodness, Samuel's severity, Joseph's temperance, Daniel's wisdom. She saw him in the zeal of his faith, like the great Elijah, in the mortification of his body, like the lofty John, and in his unsurpassed love, like Paul. One of the most developed of these catalog texts in the Cappadocian corpora comes in Gregory Nazianzen's Oration 14 on love for the poor. And in it, he's going to be calling his audience to a kind of social justice project for the poor, and specifically the lepers, who are not being cared for. And this is in the context of the few years in which we see the construction of the first Christian hospital. And I've drawn up for you there in text 11 a catalog that Nazianzen presents only slightly less tersely than what you have in the table here. At the very start of this oration, he's working his way towards the greatest virtue, which is, surprise, surprise, going to be love. But he works his way, starts foreshadowing this, and then works his way through quite a number of other virtues. And I won't enumerate them all, but I will call attention just to a couple of interesting points. Some of them are clearly well precedented, scripturally. Abraham's known for faith, that sort of thing. Some are let's say, point to the qualification I made to Zagzebski's definition, also precedented, but flagging Rahab as an exemplar of hospitality alongside Lot. Lot's a curious one there as well, perhaps. And then I'd also mention there are a couple of names which are a little bit more common than others on the list, and Jesus is the most common one, unsurprisingly. I'll come back to that possibly at the end. I was thinking a couple days ago, probably the best parallel for this kind of thing today is in memes. I'm not much of a memester, but some of you may have friends who are amongst the terminally online, and some of these friends may send you constantly memes. So I'm aware of the meme world. And one of the interesting things about it is that you'll sometimes see the same, forgive me if this is entirely old hat to you, but you see the same picture, but with different text overlaid. So I don't know, it could be some sort of gladiator-looking fellow, and it may say something about, I don't know, Brexit, and then all of a sudden it says something about, I don't know, are there any meme enthusiasts here? Because,
Cats, there's a lot
cats,
of cats.
there's cats. And there's almost a kind of emergent iconographic canon that seems to be forming. And there's the different, if not the instruments of martyrdom that they're appearing with, or perhaps martyrdom that they're about to inflict on others. Very strange things are happening. But the point is, there's a kind of fixed image which we recognize as being some sort of person, some sort of character playing some kind of role, and there's a core of that person's qualities or attributes which is probably not negotiable. But then there are a number of other things that are overlaid to interpret it. I asked a couple of these terminally online friends to send some, and they didn't seem to understand my request. They just sent more memes. But the closest that it came to this was there's a little girl, and she's sort of looking mischievously at the camera. In the back, there's a house which is burning down, and in one of these, the line on the top says, "There was a spider," and then at the bottom says, "Not anymore." Okay, and then the other picture the meme was the exact same picture with some other text, and it was making reference to something I didn't understand. I'm sorry. That's the closest that I can come. I think they're doing memes with the exemplars here. Okay, so we recognize something about Abraham being just and faithful. And sometimes he's going to be emphasized as faithful, sometimes he's going to be emphasized as just. We'll see some more wildly divergent memes in just a moment. I want to draw your attention to, not just yet, steady, Gregory Nazianzen's attack on the gods. And this will play into some of the culture war angles here. As was mentioned earlier, it's not original at all for Christians of this period to be attacking gods for immorality. Pagans had been doing this for the better part of 1,000 years already. But Nazianzen does it in catalog form, and it seems to me that he wants to lodge in people's memories the association of somebody like Kronos with filial impiety, Zeus with the same, and also with lust, pederasty, that sort of thing. Apollo, to be a byword for deceit, along with Hermes, something like greed, crass commercialism. Ares ends up standing for wrath, violence, Dionysius, drunkenness, Artemis, treacherous hospitality. Hephaestus, that's a bit unfortunate. He is mostly criticized for being a limping god, so perhaps a too classicizing moment by Gregory. I think it does a few things, this kind of association. One, it's a sort of ritual performance of attacking the gods. That's perfectly fine. Maybe trying to drive home a little bit and reject a kind of allegorical reading that thoughtful pagans would have been long accustomed to by now. And that sense serve an apotreptic function. Hey, pagans, take this seriously. These are in your stories. And then maybe turn them towards true God, protreptic. But also somehow to be paranetic, so encouraging of Christians who are already on the Christian path, in the sense that we're not just rejecting these gods for being sinful or vicious in some way. We're also rejecting these vices because they're tied to these idolatrous gods. But now I want to draw your attention to text 12, which should be what Gregory does with these gods in his oration for Athanasius. After Athanasius' death, Athanasius is a very authoritative figure in the Christological debates, and Gregory has some advantage to gain by invoking his memory and by being seen to some extent as his heir and his successor. But the way he does this is by applying, amongst other ways, by applying epithets drawn from the Greek gods to Athanasius. He says, Athanasius was simple in character, but his skills as a leader were manifold. He was wise in speech, wiser still in his understanding. He was a man of the streets, to the more lowly sorts, yet of greater dignity than those of more exalted station. He was hospitable, protector of suppliants, and averter of evils. One man was truly everything that the sons of the Greeks ascribe in parts to their various gods. I will add that he was marital and virginal, peaceful and a conciliator, and an escort for those hastening on from this life. So each one of these, sometimes in translation paraphrastic, descriptors is either directly taken from a well-attested epithet for the gods or is close to one, which is really quite extraordinary. In this case, you have something like the core of the meme is the virtue, and the person is being overlaid. So there's agreement on what the virtue is, but you have a serious act of cultural replacement, which is being done very, very deliberately by Gregory here. Okay, I'll conclude this section by noting a few things that Julian does. So Julian knows the scriptures fairly well. And he's playing his own game. I haven't given you texts of his, and I'll just allude to things I found in various places, where you have in Nazianzen and others, Abraham being righteous or faithful, Moses a great leader, Jesus is charitable, he's ascetic, and so on. Paul is chaste and loving. In Julian, we find Abraham being a bit barbaric, but actually he tries to recast him as a practitioner of theurgy, a kind of a diviner because of his experience of God in the sacrifice and division of the various animal offerings. He sees him as a practitioner of the kind of theurgy that he wants to restore. He's being a bit tongue-in-cheek about all this, but he's seriously recasting a beloved exemplar. Moses ends up being sort of philosophically inept, so in contrast to maybe what the general respect would have been for Mosaic learning a few centuries before, Julian heaps scorn on his account of the creation. But he says at least he's kind of a practitioner of theurgy as well. Jesus is this kind of proletarian carpenter. Paul is just a charlatan. All right, why should we care? I'm conscious of the time, so I will be somewhat swift in this and divide the why should we care portion into two headings. One is why should we care as people who are interested as historical observers, commentators, historians even, and the other is as some kind of ethical aspirants of the kind that some of these writers may have idealized. And in the first instance, as historians of sorts, I think the kinds of things that I've been indicating to you, these virtue-vice associations, are one way that one could track something like cultural change and use exemplars and the ways they're defined as an index of how a culture is shifting. The example of the gods being repurposed is a very, very clear one. There are some which are more contentious in their renegotiation, heroes of mythology or historical figures. I'm not going to go into texts 13 and 14, but Alexander has a pretty favorable review in some of the Christian sources, but he's recast and he's read, it seems, in ways that are shared, at least amongst our little group of Christians, but don't seem to be shared entirely by pagans. We can also see some kind of aggregate tendencies. The numbers of times an exemplar is used in exactly the same way as in one author as compared to another. This is the statistics side. Dr. Greensmith may remember from my confirmation of status. I was sort of screen bleary, and I think I even mentioned in that interview, I said, it's 300 lines into an Excel spreadsheet. Like, what? I thought I was studying classics. But I've got percentages for you if you want later. But there are some of these authors who are much more idiosyncratic, and so you have in some kinds of texts. You have somebody like Nazianzen who's making virtue-vice associations that are unique to him something like 80% of the time. Neeson is much less ambitious. It's only about 20%. So you can do that sort of thing. A little more interesting, if you have to use statistics for this kind of reading, is what I call golden age analysis. So someone said you can tell it's sort of where you are on the political spectrum depending on the time period for which you feel nostalgia. Sometimes conservatives will feel nostalgia for, 19th century, or there's another breed who look to the 16th century or the 14th century, 12th. The progressives, on the other hand, are nostalgic for the future in some sense. You can go through orations and homilies, other writings, and just tally up where do the exemplars of reference come from. And so I think I gave you some of those in text 15. I hope that's true. There they are. So this is not for all of their corpora, but this is a selection of orations that have some kind of imperial theme. And the two tables there show preferred biblical source period, 1, 2, 3, and the next show secular source period. So maybe not surprising for some of the orations that in the first table, the biblical point of reference in addressing crises in the empire will be the divided kingdom or the undivided kingdom. Gospels maybe can take as obligatory to show up in any Christian discourse, although that's not actually the case. There are some who more strongly emphasize Gospels and some who don't very much at all, including Synesius, bit of an outlier in the Christian world in that. But and likewise, when drawing on secular history, you can look to a kind of heroic age as your point of reference. You can look to Olympus, and you can look to Roman Empire. You can look to classical Greece. And it turns out that there are tendencies in different authors, and some of these show up fairly regularly, enough to suggest shared readings. You can imagine Basil and his brother, who have in the biblical source material Gospels, Acts, Exodus in that order. You can imagine a kind of reading group in their home in Cappadocia, where they think of the questions of the day and analyze them through similar lenses. And for those two authors, secular source material is not going to be very important. I think I'll wrap it up with just the last, let's say 16, text 16 here, with the why we should care. And that's about the improvement of our characters. And the reason, which I think animates much of the writing that the Cappadocians did, in particular their references to exemplars, is explained in an early letter from Basel to Gregory Nazianzen from a time when they both finished their graduate studies, which very much as Dr. Thompson said, they undertook abroad. So in Gregory's case, he went down to Alexandria for a while, then ended up at Athens, Basel, skipping Alexandria, heading, I think, for a time in Constantinople, and then Athens. They finished their studies. They went back to Cappadocia. Basil, a bit more hardcore, went off into the wilderness and was practicing this ascetic life. Nazianzen apparently wrote him asking for advice. And he gets this long letter back, which seems to be intended for circulation. Basil says, "The best way to figure out what we are meant to do is by paying attention to the divinely inspired scriptures. For there we find practical guides to our actions, and there too the lives of blessed men, which are as if living icons of the orderly life lived in accordance with God. There such lives have been written down, transmitted, set before us for the imitation of their good deeds. So, wherever someone feels he is lacking something, by spending time with it, he will find, as if from some public pharmacy, a drug to treat what ails him." And that's the great motivation that I think these gentlemen had in their casting of exemplars as being paradigmatic, living types of virtues and vices. A lot of questions that we can raise about that, but I think we'll stop there.